On this IMTS Investigates, we speak with Terry and Leon Resnick of Resnick Associates about succession planning for businesses.
We're here at the MFG meeting this afternoon with Terry and Lee Resnick of Resnick Brother Associates. They are estate planners, and they've been speaking with our members this afternoon on succession planning. Oddly enough, they're not related. It's weird. But before we go too much further, fellas, I know that you went into some granular detail with some of the members and took some questions, but there's some things I wanted to look at from a higher level. And I think there's always a question about at what point do you need to engage in a succession planner or a business planner? Is there a certain threshold in dollars? Is it only for larger companies?
Well, it's not necessarily for larger companies, although the larger the company becomes, the more issues that they tend to face. I would say anytime you have a next generation or other successors coming into the business potentially is the time to start thinking about that and potentially start laying the groundwork.
Mm-hmm. And is it only for families passing a business on to family members, or are you working with business owners that are passing on to non-family members as well?
That's a good question. The majority of our clients are family held, where it is going to be staying within the family, the business, but we also do have a number of businesses that are owned by non-related business owners, and they also have succession issues that we have to deal with.
Are there different tax events, different tax liabilities with a family member versus non-family member?
There can be. When you look at taxes from the estate tax standpoint, when a business is being passed down from one generation to the next, currently everyone's protected from $5 million of assets that they can shelter from estate taxes. When you go beyond that, you can have estate taxes that kick in when you attempt to transfer the business down. Mm-hmm. And if your planning is not done properly, the business may actually be forced to be sold to pay a tax liability, so there is no business to be passed down at that point.
Are you seeing in this changing economy, more of a high-tech economy, are you seeing a less traditional path for family-owned businesses in terms of succession? I think perhaps in my father's age or before that, you grew up and you went into the family business and that was it. Are you seeing the kids move on to a different path now?
Well, we're seeing certainly some kids do go away from the business. They choose their own career, their own profession, but there's still a lot that stay within the family business. Mm-hmm. They were raised in the business, they were raised around the business, and that's the path in life that they've chosen. And that's what makes the succession planning so critical, to make sure that the business ultimately can transition down.
Mm-hmm. And one thing we like to offer, and we try and impress upon this when we do these seminars, for parents, when we talk about their succession plan, well, yes, technically it is their succession plan, but ultimately it's the children's succession plan, because if the parents do not do a good, solid plan, mm-hmm. the children are the ones that suffer. They may ultimately not have a business to run, or they end up getting a very weakened business because the parents did not do a good plan.
And how much is that affected among those kids that are going to actively run the business versus perhaps somebody who just is going to take some income out of it but not have an active role? I know there's a lot of complications that can arise out of that. Are you advising the active participants, the employees of the company, as well as those in a more passive role?
Well, not necessarily. We don't really work with the non-family employees. Mm-hmm. It's really focused more on the family ownership level to transition down to the family. Now, there are some family businesses that will not transfer to family members, and at that point, it may be key employees that ultimately become owners of that company, and then they would be engaged in the discussions.
I heard you talking earlier this afternoon. You gave an example of a family that had 3 children, 2 sons that were very active in the business, and a daughter who was not. Mm-hmm. And there was a distribution in place. Shortly after the succession began, one of the sons passed in an accident. His ownership stake transferred to his wife, who was not skilled in the business and not very popular with the other kids, but she saw an opportunity to form an alliance with the more passive sister, and suddenly the son, who was very active, is now in a minority role. Right. So how much are you trying to map out different scenarios with your clients as you meet with them?
That's a good question, and we use that case study a lot because it's really hits home for a lot of people, because what that really pinpoints is a real family that has an active or 2 active children in that case and an inactive child in that case. And the goals for the parents are to make sure the business continues. And we've always been huge proponents in only active children getting company stock. Inactive children, like the daughter in that example, should receive non-business assets. And the specific point that you mentioned where the son died and the stock went to the non-popular wife, in that case, or the daughter-in-law, it was specifically because they did not have a buy-sell agreement. So in that scenario, with that family situation, we're talking about buy-sell agreements. We're talking about estate equalization for that non-active daughter that you referenced to make sure that she does not have to have any involvement with the business. And ultimately that the two boys that are running the business and the clear heir apparents of the business end up with the business. So it's really a multi-pronged approach when you have a family business, and there's just a lot of dynamics involved with it.
Is there the possibility of going too far with your planning and having too many generation, whether it's kids, grandkids, what have you, all taking some type of attribute from the estate? Do people go too far and make it unnecessarily complex?
Yes, it is very definite, yes. And what happens in those cases is typically you have a business that becomes very successful. The business value increases dramatically, and the CPA typically, or maybe the attorney says to the business owner, you need to start getting some value out of your estate. You have kids, you have grandkids, let's start giving business interest to all of them. The problem with that is, even though from a tax standpoint it's a good thing, from a practicality standpoint it's a bad thing, because you have potentially 10, 15, 20 owners of a privately held company. You may only have 1 or 2 people actively working in there. Even though they're minority interests, that those they still have rights, and they can still cause problems. So we always really tell our clients and other people that are in these areas that as important as tax planning is, you don't let the tax tail wag the dog. So even if it's effective tax planning, it may not make sense from a practical standpoint. So
and even if you thought that, well, we've given them Class B non-voting stock, they can't affect us. That's not the case.
Not necessarily, because even though it's non-voting stock, they still have rights to the books. They're still an owner of the company, and it causes potential problems. We talk about pruning the shareholder tree, because it's very easy when you start out with 3 kids in the business who then have 2 or 3 kids of their own, and all of a sudden you could have dozens of shareholders, and it causes potential problems.
And then even though they're minority interests, let's say there's a minority shareholder, they get divorced. Now there's an ex-wife holding company stock of a family. They're not, so you can see the problems can really escalate.
Well, we're going to wrap this up, but I'm wondering if there's 1 or 2 key points that you would recommend to anybody who's even considering succession planning. Where do they start? If they had to think about just 2 things, what would those 2 things be for you two?
My 2 things for anyone considering succession planning is, first, what are their ultimate goals for that business? Where do they want it to end up? And secondly, that they have to take the time to look at the entire picture and figure out, we need to address the topic. The biggest area of problems we see is just complacency. Business owners are not doing it. If you're not complacent, you can be proactive and get the job done.
And if I can follow up on that, the people that do their planning, we would strongly encourage that it is reviewed every year or whenever there's a material change to their business or family. Many people may have a very good plan initially. Circumstances may change and it becomes outdated and antiquated. It's not consistent with current tax law or even what their situation is anymore. And we see that far too often.
Do you guys have kids?
I have 2.
They're well taken care of, aren't they?
They're doing okay.
I bet they are. Thank you, Terry and Leon, for your time today. Thank you for being at the MFG meeting.
Thank you.
This is Bill Herman for IMTS in Brief.